Hello and welcome to my video. Today we're going to be talking about the Romanovs. Now, you've probably all heard about what happened to the Romanovs. And no, I don't mean Romanov, I mean Romanovs. Now, even though you've heard about these Romanovs, have you heard about the rest of their family and their dynasty as a whole? Probably not. So take a seat, get a snack, and get ready for me to talk until you either get tired of me for talking for too long or until I think the video is long enough for you to be able to hold all of the information I'm about to give you. Now, we're going to start with Michael I of Russia, who started his rule in 1613, kicking off the Romanov dynasty to a start. Now, to reference a good time frame here, Michael had come into power just 5 years before the 30 Years' War. You know, the war that started off fighting for religious freedom, which then moved to balance of power. You know, just the usual stuff. Anyway, let's move on to what Michael did and why he was so important. Now, Michael Romanov was born in July of 1596. He had taken his position as Tsar after the end of Dmitry Trubovsky's rule. He was inexperienced, to say the least. No one had really prepared him for the sheer amount of work that needed to be done, but for as young as he was, he did quite well. One of the things he did was make peace with Sweden in 1617 with the Treaty of Stolbovo, ending Sweden's intervention in Russia's internal political affairs and blocking Russia from the Baltic Sea. He also made peace with Poland in the following year to end the ongoing violence between Poland and Russia that had begun with the death of Ivan the Terrible. He had also restored the economy and trade after the times of troubles, as well as reorganizing the chaos that was the army at the time. Unfortunately, though, he had passed away at the age of 49. But, fortunately for us, and fortunately for our lesson, he did marry a beautiful woman named Natalia and had a son. Now, this takes us to our next star. Tsar. Born March 1629, Alexis Romanov was the one who succeeded Michael after his death. He, at the time when he took up the throne, was only 16, as his father was. He began his reign in 1645 after being extremely prepped and prepared by his tutor Boris Ivanovich, who was also his brother-in-law. Even though they had a strong bond through knowledge, he eventually exiled him after an uprising in Moscow in 1648. Now, this uprising was referred to as the Salt Riot because of the universal salt tax to replenish the state treasury after the time of troubles. Now, because of this, the people demanded a land assembly which dealt with issues of war, peace, taxation, succession of the throne, and laws. These new laws were referred to as, well, this complicated word that I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, which in turn defined the term serfdom. Although the riots may have seemed bad, things only got worse. Remember the peace that Michael had made with Poland all those years ago? Yeah, now they're at full-blown war. And remember that thing with Sweden too? Yeah, that's also chucked out the window as well. But the thing that ended the war and the fighting, that would be known as the Treaty of Andrevuso, which Russia granted peace and free trade in exchange of possession of these places. Now, even through all these things, he was seen as a very kind and respectable leader to his people. But he didn't put the right people in charge, which was his main weakness. Now, he had actually married 2 times, with a total of 16 children born. Most of them died as infants or in their young teens, so I'll only be mentioning the ones that had ruled or had part in ruling after his death. Now, the first son to rule after Alexis was Fyodor III. He started his reign in January 1676 at the age of 15. Definitely younger when his father and grandfather started, but he was well educated for his time to come to the throne. Although he was well educated, his youth and his health had become hindering to his ability to participate in government affairs. Because of this, his uncle Ivan took his place until he too was replaced by two men who had shared his educational background. Through these two, Russia was immersed into Polish customs, Roman Catholic Orthodox doctrines, and Latin books. But after 1681, Vasily versus Golitsyn became a powerful figure in Fyodor's administration. Under this influence, military reforms were undertaken, and the system of this word, where a noble was assigned a service position by their family's rank, was abolished. Now, Fyodor ended up dying without giving any sort of heir to the throne, which was a problem. So, with much debate, his younger brother and his half-brother succeeded and co-ruled, with his younger sister acting as a regent for both. Now this leads us into our next two czars. I know, right? Two at once? Are you kidding me? Yeah, it seems like they made a compromise, as brothers do. Our first co-ruler is Fyodor's younger brother, Ivan V, who unfortunately was physically and mentally worse than Fyodor, even having been paralyzed in his later years. Originally, his half-brother Peter the Great had been named Tsar of Russia, but due to their sister Sophia, they had to share the title to keep their side of the family in power. Although her power didn't last long, as she was forced into a convent by Peter, who was tired of sharing the power. But because Peter was still not of proper age to rule, his mother had now become their regent until her death in 1694. Now, 2 years later, after she became regent, Ivan also passes, making Peter the sole Tsar at the age of 24. Now, his reign is very well known in Russian history. To summarize his accomplishments is a very hard thing to do, but I shall attempt for the sake of this video. He had modernized Russia, which had been lagging behind in the Western countries, causing it to become a major power. He did this through constant travel to and from Russia and other European countries, disguising himself as workers like carpenters, fishermen, and so on. He was then referred to as Peter the Great due to these advancements, and not only was his reign and empire great, but so was he. He was quite tall, actually, growing to a solid 6 feet 8 inches. Now, Peter was married twice, just like his father. His mother had picked out his first wife for him, but after much time it proved to be a mismatch between the two. They did manage to have 3 children before Peter sends her away to a convent like his sister. But before having divorced his wife, he had quite a few mistresses he was spending time with. Many of them. Although none of them married him, he did spend time with a certain mistress for 12 years after sending his wife away. After much time, though, he did find his second wife, which actually turned out to be one of his old mistresses. Together, they had 5 children before their marriage, and there is speculation that they wed earlier, but there is no solid proof. His wife, Catherine, had given birth to another 6 children, totaling his children to 11. His only surviving son, Alexei, had become heir, but after defecting to Austria, he was imprisoned for treason and questioned, as well as tortured. He had succumbed to the torture at the age of 28, leaving no male son and as heir left when Peter died. His grandson, though, Alexei's son, Peter, is only 10 and cannot rule, so those in power declare his wife, Catherine, to be empress. But it is cut short as she dies 2 years after her rule. Now, with no choice, Peter II is crowned an emperor. Remember that one wife of Peter the Great that he put into the convent, though? Yeah, well, she's back to live with her grandson, Peter II. Of course, Peter is too young to rule and is heavily influenced by those who ruled in his name. During this time, they had subsequently moved Peter's capital from St. Petersburg to Moscow. Peter was set up for marriage at the age of 14, but unfortunately, he had died on the day of his wedding from smallpox. With this, the direct male line of descendants to the Romanov family had died with him. So now the question still remained. Who was next to rule? There are no males left, so it comes down to 5 female candidates. These women being Catherine, Anna, and another daughter, which were daughters of Ivan, as well as Anna and Elizabeth, who were daughters of Peter the Great. The Supreme Privy Council selected Ivan's daughter Anna, and she is now empress. At this time, she had already become a widow and had never remarried, but had several lovers at the time, which makes the line of succession even rougher, because she didn't remarry. But thankfully, she had named her successor as her grandnephew, Ivan IV. Ivan was only 2 months old when he was named as her successor, meaning he could not rule at all yet. In fact, he didn't ever really rule, because 13 months in, Peter's daughter Elizabeth seizes power, and with that, Ivan is imprisoned and stays that way until he dies at the age of 22. Now, Empress Elizabeth reigned for 20 years. During this time, she had exiled a lot of German advisors due to them being unpopular and seen as an enemy. She had also passed several pieces of legislation that undid a lot of what her father had worked so hard for to limit the church's power. She did hate bloodshed, and as a result, she went to great lengths to alter Russia's system of punishment, even going as far as outlawing capital punishment. She had also enjoyed architecture and oversaw and financed many construction projects, one of them being the reconstruction of Peterhof Palace, which added several wings. But she passed before she was able to see the final product. Before she had passed, though, she had her 14-year-old nephew, Peter, come from Germany to Russia to live with her, in which he lived a pro-Prussian all his life. She had also found him a wife to marry, another German-raised princess who went by the name of Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornberg, otherwise known as Catherine. She, aside from her new husband, knew how to prosper in Russia, fully integrating herself as a Russian and even overthrowing Peter and taking over as empress. He also had him imprisoned and killed to secure such a position. Catherine was known as a socially enlightened ruler. She was a patron of the arts and even opened the Hermitage Museum. Under her influence, the Russian eventually adopted Western European philosophies and culture. Now, let's have a timeline check. It is now 1789 and the French Revolution has begun. Now, stay with me, please. Don't lose your head. See what I did there? Anyway, she had gained much respect with the military, which had gained her victories in battles. Because of her successful reign, she was deemed as Catherine the Great. But, as they say, all good things must come to an end. As great as her reign was, there was still those that resented her and those who spread false rumors about her. Catherine had died in her bed from a stroke at the old age of 67. She was so hated by some of the enemies that she had that they had spread rumors that her death was caused by her having a stroke while on the toilet. Some had even said it was because she had intercourse with a horse, which, of course, none were true. She had a total of 4 surviving children. 3 were conceived during her husband's lifetime, although it was really doubtful that they were the actual children of her husband, due to her having many, many lovers. And her 4th and final child, a daughter, was born in 1775, after his death, and it was concluded that the child was from one of her lovers. Now, her firstborn son, Paul, was crowned emperor after her passing, and as his first act was to destroy her testament, as he was afraid it would exclude him from succeeding and leave it to his son, Alexander. Peter was idealistic and capable of great generosity, but it was also capable of vindictiveness. In spite of suspicion and of legitimacy, he greatly resembled his father and many other Romanov men, as well as their character. He had spent his first year trying to undo a lot of the policies his mother had put into place. Those who opposed his ideals were, of course, dismissed or lost their places at court. Because of this, 7 field marshals and 333 generals fell under this predicament. Now, Polyboy had a deep hate for the French all the way before their revolution, but even more now with their republican and anti-religious views. He also knew that their expansion hurt Russian interests. Another reason he hated the French was because of the island of Malta. Napoleon had seized Malta, which had greatly offended Paul. But it was understandable. A lot of people probably hated Napoleon too. Now, Paul had married his first wife, Natalia, but she had died in childbirth, so Paul found a second wife. Man, a lot of these Russians are such ladies' men. Paul eventually had 10 children with his second wife, Maria, one of those children being Alexander. Paul's mother had originally wanted Alexander to succeed the throne, but because Paul is Paul, he got to it first. Because karma exists, Paul was assassinated in his 4th regional year by a group of Russian officers. So, as per Catherine's wishes, Alexander succeeds to the throne. Now, Alexander was raised by Catherine, as she preferred him over her actual son. Now, Alexander had started his rule during the Napoleonic Wars, meaning there was stuff to get done. Originally, he had joined Britain in the War of the Third Coalition against Napoleon, but after suffering great loss, he turned to form an alliance by the Treaty of Tilsit. During the second half of this time, he became fearful and paranoid of possible plots against him. He had also purged schools of foreign teachers as education became more religiously driven as well as politically conservative. Now, going back to his early years, as a 15-year-old, he was set to wed his wife Elizabeth. From the marriage, they had 2 daughters. Alexander had the usual bastard children, but again, there was no legal son to take over after his death. But to his surprise, his brother Nicholas becomes the new emperor after Alexander dies of typhus. Nicholas had not been raised as an heir apparent, but when Alexander passes and his brother Constantine refuses, he had really no other choice. One note to make is that when he had begun his reign, it landed on a Monday, and according to Russian superstition, Mondays were considered to be unlucky. Now, Nicholas had abolished several areas of local autonomy, but as an exception to this trend, Finland was able to keep its autonomy due to the crushing of the November uprising in Poland. Russia's first railway was also opened under his rule in 1837. Alexander is eventually married to his wife, Grand Duchess Alexandra, and they end up having 10 children. For a long while, everything seems to go smoothly, as they should have been. Their firstborn was even a son, so when Nicholas died of what seemed to be natural causes, his son Alexander succeeded him as Alexander II of Russia. Now, Alexander was also known as Alexander the Liberator due to the fact that he had brought an end to serfdom, which had been very common in Russia for centuries. He had changed rules on conscription, as it had been enforced for only the peasantry, whereas serfs were drafted by their landowners, which was widely considered a life sentence. He had also been the one to sell Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million, which in today's money would be considered $133 million. Now, Alexander's wife was Maria, and they had 6 children. There were 4 sons and 2 daughters. His second son, Alexander III, had to take over emperor after his father was murdered by members of the People's Will movement, to which he died from someone throwing a bomb at him twice. And as the crowd dissipated, there was a third bomber, just in case the first 2 didn't work. Now, Alexander III disliked the extravagance of his family, so to fix it, he limited the title of Grand Duke to Duchess and only children and male line grandchildren of emperors. The rest would just have the new title of Serene Highness. All of his internal reforms aimed to reverse the liberalization that occurred during his father's time. He had also weakened the power of the Zemstvo, but because of his such bold and quick actions after his father's death, the same people who murdered Alexander II now wanted to murder him. But before they could get to him, illness had caught up to him. He had come down with terminal kidney disease. It is stated that he died in the arms of his wife after giving his son's fiancée his blessing. With that, we come to the last family of the Romanov dynasty. And wow, that was a lot to take in. So take a deep breath, pause if you need to, as this one's a bit of a doozy. Now, the last emperor was Alexander III's son, Nicholas II. He married the aforementioned fiancée, Alexandra. Now, their story is well known, as stated at the beginning of this video. Now, let's do another timeline check. We are now in World War I territory, but not for long, as Nicholas had Russia actually withdraw from the war pretty early on. So together, he and his wife had 5 children, with their youngest, Alexei, being their only son. But the only problem? He had hemophilia, which was common in royal families, but they kept it secret because they needed a healthy and strong heir to take up the throne. But it wasn't going to be his disease that would end little Alexei's life. It would be the incoming Russian Revolution. People saw the leadership shown from Nicholas was weak, and that he had clung to autocracy despite these new times. They had also started going on strikes due to low wages, horrible working conditions, and industrialization hazards. In the middle of the night, Yakov Yaversky ordered the family's physician to wake them and to tell them to get dressed under the context that they were being moved to a safe and secure location. So that way they would not be harmed by those who wanted to harm them from the revolution. The family was then ordered into a 20 by 16 foot semi-basement room. Nicholas had then requested for 2 chairs, to which Alexei and his wife Alexandra had sat. After a time, an execution squad of secret police entered the room, informing the family that they had made the executive decision to execute the family. The Empress and her daughter Olga had tried to bless themselves, but had failed amid the shooting of the guns. The order of their death goes as follows. Nicholas to the torso, then to the upper chest. Alexandra to the head. One daughter, Maria, to the thigh. After the smoke had cleared from all the gunshots, the shooters had realized the children had still been uninjured with the exception of Maria's thigh, and they were whimpering and hiding in corners. As they began again, they went straight for their heads. First, Alexei, Tatiana, Anastasia, Olga, and then finally Maria. It had taken a bit of time as they had diamonds sewn into their clothing, but they had used bayonets to stab them to ensure a fatality. Some believe that the Grand Duchess Anastasia, as before mentioned, had possibly slipped by and not been executed that night. Hence the movies Anastasia and many documentaries trying to prove that she might have lived a full life. This was due to the fact that the family's bodies were heavily disfigured from being dumped into a pit and doused with sulfuric acid. Because of this, people had thought Anastasia's body was lost among the corpses. Some women even came forward claiming to be the lost daughter, but they were all proven to be false, as the women were either schizophrenic or just wanted the fame. And they were also proven false because there was very little to no chance that she would have been able to escape her horrible, horrible fate that night. So, after all this, I think I might need to watch a Disney movie. But hey, you just learned some information about one of Russia's really powerful dynasties. A lot of information, too. So, I hope you ate something or took some breaks in there, because this was a bit of a long one. Definitely thought it was going to last an hour, but it didn't. So, I hope you enjoyed. If you made it this far, I guess you kind of did, because there's no way that a normal, sane person would willingly watch through all of this. So, thank you for watching, and, yeah. I'm gonna go take a nap.